Jeffrey Wasserstrom is Chancellor's Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine, where he also serves as the editor of the Journal of Asian Studies and holds a courtesy position in the law school. He's the author of 4 books, including China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, published in 2010 and republished again in 2013, and the editor or co-editor of several others, including Chinese Characters, Profiles of Fast-Changing Lives in a Fast-Changing Land, which was published by the University of California Press in 2012. In addition to contributing to a range of scholarly periodicals, he has written commentaries and reviews for newspapers such as the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal, as well as for the online and print editions of a wide variety of magazines, including Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, The Nation, Outlook India, and both Time and Newsweek. He blogs regularly for the Huffington Post, co-founded the China Beat blog, a major source of information and opinion on China from 2008 through mid-2012, is co-editor of the Asia section of the Los Angeles Review of Books, and is an associate fellow of the Asia Society. He has given talks on China on 4 continents and has been a guest on radio programs such as NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered, and American Public Media's Marketplace. He was educated at UC Santa Cruz, Harvard, and Berkeley, as well as at the University of London and Shanghai's Fudan University. Before returning to his native California 7 years ago, he taught at the University of Kentucky, his first job, and at Indiana University, where he spent a decade and a half as a member of the history department and served for a time as a director of the East Asian Studies Center. He is a regular guest presenter at the Shanghai International Literary Festival and served as a consultant to 2 prize-winning documentary films on China produced by the Longbow Group. Please help me welcome Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom.
Thank you. And I've just gotten a wonderful welcome here, and I've been enjoying everything I've gotten to do. None of my books have been reviewed at length in the Times Literary Supplement. I have written for the TLS. Actually, one of my most recent pieces there was co-authored with a colleague in Chinese history, James Carter, in which we were trying to understand why Finnegan's Wake was a bestseller in China earlier this year when it came out. Notoriously difficult. And if you want to know more about that, ask me in the Q&A. I'll be happy to tell you. I like to begin talks based on this book or around it, around the topic of contemporary China, by doing kind of loosening up exercise as a teacher of just looking at that book. And you're usually told don't judge a book by its cover, but please judge mine by its cover. I really like the cover. The press came up with it for me, and they said, does this capture what you were trying to do? And I thought, yeah, just perfectly. And the basic way I think it works is the top picture is unlike anything I saw in China when I first went there in 1986. I lived there for a year in that special post-totalitarian pre-consumerist period in Chinese history, the 1980s, which was very special. It was hard to tell where the country was going. And you saw a lot of images like the picture at the bottom, which shows members of the Chinese Communist Party voting in unison for whatever's brought before them. And the thought was that we didn't know how China was changing, that maybe we would get to a point where we would see the kind of image you see up top. But if you saw the image up top, then presumably you would no longer see the image on the bottom. In other words, if the cultural side of things changed as much and the kind of personal expression side, then surely the political side would change in step with it. And the conundrum, trying to figure out China, as I have throughout my professional career, has been trying to figure out how you reconcile a China that is now a place where you see the top half of the picture and the bottom half of the picture. But so it's a study in contrasts of disjuncture between the two halves of the book's cover. What I like to begin by is asking people in the audience, now that I've talked about contrast between the top and the bottom, and there are no wrong answers, they're all interesting, what do you see that's similar about the top and bottom picture? What connects those two? Instead of there's some obvious contrasts. Yeah?
I was struck by Mao and Che on the T-shirt.
So at the top, there is a connection of communism and international communism and Chinese communism, the pictures of Mao and Che. Good point. Yeah?
There's some conformity to the top.
Excellent. Yes, that the people on the top and the people on the bottom are in sync with each other. Yeah. They're all male. And that is one of the things that I'm happy to talk about a lot of things that are worse that were worse about Mao's China than post-Mao China. But under Mao, there was more effort, at least attention, to promoting male-female equality. One of the first things that the Chinese Communist Party did after taking power in 1949 was introduce a new marriage law in 1950 that equalized the rights of women and was much more progressive in many ways than laws in other places. But since Mao's death, and the incoming of the market, there's been a step back from that. There were never many female leaders high up in the regime, but certainly that male domination is worth noting. Other things that connect the top and the bottom. There are a couple more things. One is that the color red figures fairly prominently in both, and that's not accidental. I mean, it has something to do with red as the international color of communism, but boy, were the Chinese communists lucky that red had been decided to be the international color of communism when they were founded. Because red is also in Chinese culture a color of happiness, fecundity, and joy. The rivals of the Chinese Communist Party, I'll be talking about Mao's great rival was Chiang Kai-shek, and he ran the Nationalist Party. And the color of anti-communism at that point in the world was white. So you talk about red Russians and white Russians. Unfortunately, in Chinese culture, white is the color of mourning. So you could either be the color of happiness and joy and fecundity or the color of death. That's not why the Communist Party beat the Nationalist Party, but it certainly didn't help. The most telling or the most interesting similarity between top and bottom, and I did not notice this, a colleague of mine who grew up in China and teaches at Irvine mentioned it. The thing that you really have in common about the guys on the top and the guys on the bottom is they all dye their hair. And they dye their hair, that's partly that conformity thing of the top and the bottom, which was mentioned. But it's also the Chinese Communist Party keeps saying it's handing off power to a younger generation, but only a slightly younger generation. So it's 70-year-olds passing off to 68-year-olds, passing off to 63-year-olds, and so forth. So that jet black dyed hair is very interesting there. So I love this picture. This was the picture on the 2010 first edition of the book. And I was really worried that I wanted to update the book, but I also wanted to use a version of the cover. So the question would be, there was a change in leadership coming up. Xi Jinping took over from Hu Jintao in 2012, which was one of the reasons why we thought an update in 2013 would be useful. So the real question was, would we be able to keep this cover? And what we were waiting to see was a picture of the new leadership group, the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is the center of power within the Chinese Communist Party. And lo and behold, here was the picture of the new Standing Committee. And I like that picture because it's the Standing Committee and they're all standing. But no problem. They're all still dyeing their hair. They're all still men. The picture still works. So the new edition of the book could come out looking very much like the earlier one, though even more accentuating the red there. At first, we didn't want the book to be red because that seemed too tacky with all China books had to be red. But now we're just giving in. So when I give a talk like this, and the book is called, subtitled, What Everyone Needs to Know. That's not my pompous subtitle. It's a series that Oxford has, the What Everyone Needs to Know series. They're kind of like the Guides for Dummies or the Idiot's Guide, but this is Oxford University Press after all, so they've got to sound a little more serious. And actually, the book that started this was called What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam. It was written by a man named John Esposito, a specialist in Islamic studies. After 9/11, he began collecting the questions that he got asked by audiences when he gave public talks that seemed to reveal misunderstandings of one sort or another about Islam. He put up his answers together and tried to come up with lively and as well as informative answers, sent the book off to Oxford as What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam, and it sold well. And so Oxford decided to do a whole short book series of topics that seemed to have a certain urgency that you'd want a quick fix on. So I can't tell you everything you need to know. For that, you need to buy the book. Which, as I like to tell people, is the shortest book I've ever written and the cheapest book I've ever written, and is available from Amazon if you didn't get a copy here. I can't tell you everything you need to know. I can tell you 5 things I think it would be very useful for every American to know. But I tell versions of this talk, different things, different places. So I always like to begin the talk with something that would never be heard anywhere else, has never been heard anywhere else, and says something about the fact that you're hearing this talk now and you're hearing it here. So luckily, China keeps being in the news, and there keep being things to play off of. And when I talk about current events, I'm often trying to explain why knowing something about the past gives you a better understanding of the present. I'm a historian, but I spend a lot of time thinking about why history matters to the present. So this was the cover, this was a story in the Los Angeles Times, my local paper, over the weekend, just before coming, and I could download it on the web. These are these wonderful pieces of territory that China and Japan look like, if cooler heads don't prevail, they could actually go into armed conflict over. They're specks of land that the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands and the Japanese call the Senkaku. And the question is who they belong to. Both countries claim that if you look at history, you will find that they clearly belong to them. Taiwan actually supports the claim that they're part of China and is getting involved. Hong Kong has opinions as well. They're specks of quite barren land, but the water around them has mineral, right, and there are gas reserves. And so they're being fought over for more than just their land value. And tensions over them have been ramping up in the last couple of years for different ways. They got ramped up with Japan at one point, getting more assertive about its rights because it has tended to control them and make each time that one side or the other makes a move, the other says that they're being unfairly aggressive and so forth. But what happened most recently was China established a zone, an air defense zone over these, and said that they were claiming control of the islands, which meant they controlled the airspace over it, and would treat as an aggressive act anybody that flew over them without getting permission first. So this was the conflict that ramped up. So this is an image of the overlapping zones that Japan claims as its airspace and China claims as its airspace. The red area up there is what China has just said is its airspace, and the blue area is what Japan has said it is. And right around where they overlap is where the reserves are believed to be under the water. China has similar disputes in Southeast Asia with Vietnam and with the Philippines. So why does China care so much? I mean, it's partly about the reserves, and it's partly a fight over resources. But there is another reason as well why China cares so much. This is a political cartoon showing the worry is that since the United States is an ally of Japan, that it will get drawn into this battle over there. And the United States immediately announced that it thought that China had behaved inappropriately, claiming that no-fly zone, just as Japan did as well. And the worry about what will happen with disputed airspace is something that isn't just in the abstract. In 2001, I don't know how many of you remember this, there was an American surveillance jet, or spy plane, that was flying off the coast of China in what China believed was violating its sovereignty. And so a Chinese small jet was buzzing them, trying to get the Americans out off their territory. The American plane and the Chinese plane collided. The Chinese pilot died, and the Americans had to make a crash landing on Hainan Island. And for several days, there was a very tense standoff in which the American crew was being detained on the island. And there were all sorts of worries about how this would be resolved. It brought back some memories, and this will come back in another setting, of for Americans, whenever something like that happens, we think of the Iran hostage crisis and moments like that. It was eventually resolved. The Americans apologized, and the crew went back. But this is a worry about the kind of thing that could happen. Now, this is the connection to where you are hearing this talk. When many Chinese think about issues like this, like the control of Chinese sovereignty, foreign countries bullying them in one way or another as they saw the spy plane crisis, they think back to what's called, what's emphasized in patriotic education in China as the century of humiliation. The period from the First Opium War of 1839 to 1842 until the Japanese invasions during World War II of the 1940s, when China lost control of its own destiny. This is how it's taught. It's taught that foreign powers disrespected China, tried to carve it up into zones of influence, and then at the worst moment during the Japanese invasion, tried to turn China into a full colony of this. The reason why this is relevant for where you're hearing this is in the opium trade that led to this, this war and this clash in which foreign powers were trying to forcibly open China to trade. British trade in opium was part of the problem. The British were the ones who went to war with China over the opium trade. But the other people who were trying to sell opium to the Chinese were the Americans, among others, and some of the ships that were involved came from this seacoast here. When Chinese think back to the terrible things that happened before the Communist Party came to power, they often show an image of this ruins down below. That's a ruin of a beautiful palace in China that in 1860 was destroyed during the Second Opium War by British and French troops. And what the Chinese patriotic education leaves out of the story is the reason why the palace was destroyed was because some British and French envoys who were trying to negotiate a peace in this war were mistreated, tortured, and some of them killed, which violates how diplomats are supposed to be taught. So this is a disputed part of history, like many parts of history are. But in the Chinese popular imagination, or at least the version of it taught officially, a key fact of the past for China is that for 100 years, they were bullied by foreign countries that wanted to do things in China that they weren't even allowed to do within their own countries, including, for some points, selling opium. When the Chinese think about this period, or many of them, the image that will come to mind from education will be this period when colonial powers carved up different parts of China, had zones of influence. And what the Communist Party tells the story, at least, is until we came to power in 1949, no government was able to maintain and defend China's territorial integrity. And what the Chinese Communist Party was able to do was to reestablish control over the whole country and as much of that country as possible. And this narrative that talks about this narrative of being carved up, being almost pushed to extinction, and now bouncing back, helps to explain, though it doesn't justify, why the current regime is so intent upon not letting any part of the territory under its control slip out of its control, including areas like Tibet that could have their own arguments for independence and could see China, and with justification, as being a colonial power toward them just the way China objected to the others. But in any case, and particularly Japan, remember, was the worst of the invaders during that period. So to have a part of land that is disputed between China and Japan with this kind of historical mythology based on some things that really happened, but ramped up through patriotic nationalistic education, gives these things a special kind of power. Here's a cartoon booklet that was put out in 1950 by the Chinese Communist Party as a set of before and after shots of the bad old days before the Communist Party took power and the good days now that the communists were in power. And I'll tell you more about this. You'll see more of the images in later sections. But just to give away a little bit of the nub, this was put on the web a few years ago saying that some of the differences between past and present seem to have disappeared. And that in fact, China now seemed like more the before, the bad old days, than the good old days. But one of those things was, the idea was that before the Communist Party took power, American imperialists could do whatever they wanted and push China around. Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party were allied with the Americans. The Americans supplied some troops in the battle against the communists. And then in the glorious day after the Communist Party took power, the comics said, now foreigners have to obey the law. And so this notion of a China under the Communist Party being stronger and more virile in protecting all of China's national interests is a very powerful part of the story that the Communist Party tells about why it should still be allowed to rule. I was also intrigued by the fact that this story in the news about China broke simultaneously with the news of a deal with Iran. Now, these stories have nothing to do with each other, but the simultaneity was fascinating because it seemed that we were being pushed closer to conflict with China at the exact moment that we were pulling further away from conflict with Iran. And so you had the celebration by Kerry of the deal with Iran, and then during the same news cycle, the same day, he was issuing a statement about why he was angry at why the United States was angry at what China had done. And this put me in mind, always being the historian looking for analogies, to what happened when China and Iran were in the same news cycle, or virtually the same news cycle, another time. In 1979, which was a year, this is the subject of a recent book, Strange Rebels, that talks about 1979 as a year that dramatically changed the world. And on the cover you see Ayatollah Khomeini, you see Deng Xiaoping, and you see Margaret Thatcher. And if you remember back to 1979, the China story that year, in direct contrast to what I've just said about the move toward more tension with China now, in 1979 it was the end of a period of tension that began way back with the communists and the nationalists were fighting and the Americans were supporting the nationalists. Then the Communist Party took power, and once the Communist Party took power, it started denigrating America. The Chinese under Mao thought of America as the great representative of imperialism in the world. And so you had art like this. We celebrated, we were close to Chiang Kai-shek, who was then on exile in Taiwan. The Americans were backing Chiang Kai-shek. The communists were at war with Chiang Kai-shek. They weren't literally fighting anymore after he had gone to Taiwan. But the Americans were celebrating and said, our man was the one in exile, this anti-communist. Americans, we fought in the Korean War against, we were pitted the Americans against the Chinese. And this was the kind of image of China was one of the great bogeymans for Americans. And we saw it as a country of faceless automatons who carried big posters of the people they admired and were willing to do the bidding of these violent people. During the Cultural Revolution, you saw these mass scenes of large numbers of Chinese followers of Mao, fanatical young men. Try to remember the things that I'm saying. Fanatical young men following a charismatic leader for whom they would do anything to try to fight the outside world. Things started to calm down when Nixon went to China and met with Mao, and they began to move toward stepping back from the precipice of war with each other. But things really started warming up when Deng Xiaoping, following Mao, came to America in 1979. And one of the big news stories of 1979 was the normalization of relations between China and the United States, which meant that the United States and China would agree to recognize each other and establish diplomatic relations. They would get themselves on a diplomatic footing that would stop viewing each other as arch enemies. This was welcomed by many places around the world, except for a small country that was an ally of the United States, Taiwan, that saw this as selling out their interests. If you look forward at that sort of story of how the trajectory from very harsh kinds of America supports Chiang Kai-shek, then Chiang Kai-shek falls, and there's a period when America is demonized by the successor to Chiang Kai-shek. This is the Shah of Iran, who was an ally of the United States, propped up. In 1979, he falls. 1979, when China is moving out of that stage of being led by a charismatic leader who's virulently anti-American, anti-imperialist, Iran steps very much into that mold, with the Ayatollah Khomeini, the attack on Americans, and then the Iran hostage crisis being another big news story of 1979. When you have this image of things, so we've gone from a period separated from these two moments, a period in 1979 when the China threat diminishes dramatically, just as then Iran steps into very much that same position. And we can talk, I'll be happy to answer questions about, I don't want to push this analogy too far, but I think it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's an interesting phenomenon both because those movements had certain things in common. When I went to China in 1986, when the Cultural Revolution madness was very much fresh in people's minds, some of them said, the closest thing to what we went through then is what you're now seeing in Iran. Iran is now having that moment of hero worship and ideology trumping everything else that we have just gotten out of. So there are some parallels, but I think there are also some parallels in the way that we fall into traps ourselves of demonizing one or another part of the world that we fear, and we can toggle very quickly from projecting our fears and fantasies on one part of the world and to another. With the China case, the sort of basis, the earliest part of this moment was the Boxer crisis of 1900, when anti-Christian insurgents in China laid siege to foreigners in the diplomatic quarter of Beijing. And there were cables coming out, there were rumors that all of them had been killed, which later proved to be false. But the Boxers did commit a lot of violence against Christians, Chinese converts to Chinese Christians and Western missionaries. But our fantasies, when I talked about this, that we can have real reasons for these concerns about another part of the world, but we sometimes let them get out of control. This image of the Boxer as somebody who was going to try to take over the world was a projection that had very little to do with what they were doing. The Boxers didn't want to leave China. They just wanted to use, admittedly using violent means, get back control of their country from foreigners. The Boxer threat, this idea of a demonic figure from Asia, was then personified by the first Fu Manchu. The first Fu Manchu novel was published exactly a century ago, a centenary that's not being widely marked, except in China studies circles. But what interests me about it is Fu Manchu originally, this was the memory of the Boxers, so Chinese were imagined in the Western imagination as a conformist, violent culture. In contrast to the Japanese, who were learning from the West, and obviously were a very different culture, and were ready to learn and modernize. But then in World War II, we had the exact opposite thing take place. And suddenly it was the Japanese who were being personified as inherently violent and conformist and savage, unlike the good Chinese, who are our allies by that point, who wanted to learn from us and we could get along with. So you actually have this China-Japan seesaw effect throughout much of the last century, where they kind of take turns. We almost only have room in our minds for either the good Chinese or the good Japanese, or the bad Chinese and the bad Japanese, one time or another. So then, by the time you get up to the 1980s, when we're warming with China again, but we're fearing Japan, suddenly Japan is this warlike thing. In between, remember, there was the time when there was the fear of China, as represented by that dragon boat. But now you have the smiling Chinese and the samurai-like Japanese. So I think you have this kind of China-Japan seesaw effect, which I've talked about in other ones. But now I think I have to make room in it, too, for Iran fitting in one way or two, that there can be different places where we can substitute in other bogeymen for one reason or another. And it is partly about what other places are doing, but it's also partly about recurring nightmares that have something to do. And here, I just was digging around. In 1979, when the hostages were taken in Tehran, one thing that Time magazine said is, this isn't the first time that's happened. Something like this has happened before, and pointed to the Boxer Rebellion. So it's not just me who's seeing parallels of some sorts with what goes on there. And long before there was Argo, there was 55 Days at Peking, to try to show the story of a heroic rescue of foreign hostages in a distant part of the world being threatened by forces of savagery. At a moment, sometimes these can overlap. Sometimes we only have room in our mind for one bogeyman. So there was a rise in anti-Chinese sentiment or fear of China around the spy plane crisis I mentioned to you of 2001. And I really thought that anti-Chinese sentiment would begin peaking. But then 9/11 came, and the switch was very much to the Arab world. In the 1980s, the fear of Japan was simultaneously with the attacks on Iran. And so these are shared images from the early 1980s of smashing Japanese cars with the fear of Japan and saying Iranians should all be deported and that. Now I think we're back in a more familiar area of, in part, fears of China, which are not as strong as they were in the Mao years. But I think there is some of the old parallel of yellow peril fears and red menace fears at play at part in the world. And so I thought this would give another localized relation to this. I've talked about the connections between the sort of love-hate relationship there can be or problems of misunderstanding between Asia and the West. So I thought being introduced by somebody who had written about Islam in America, building it for a future without prejudice, was very fitting. Chinese Characters, another book of mine that I would be very happy to have judged by its cover. The cover are some wonderful photographs by the journalist and photojournalist Howard French. And the idea of the cover, which I think goes against all the sorts of fantasies that we have about China, in which we think of all Chinese essentially being interchangeably good or bad, is to just try to remember how to make you, when you think of China, think of it as a place populated by many different kinds of people with many different kinds of hopes and dreams and beliefs that may veer in one or another direction, but are in some ways as diversified as the residents of Europe are. China has that kind of diversity. All right, the 5 things you need to know about China, which will loop back to some of the things that have already come up. And these won't be on the midterms, so you don't have to write them down. And I will mention them again. I try to keep the number of words on my PowerPoints to a minimum. It's called Zen PowerPoint, where you just kind of throw images up and bounce off them. So the first point, today's China and Chiang Kai-shek's China are not totally dissimilar. Even though the Communist Party would like to say they have a narrative. Up to 1949, things went one way. After that, everything changed. Not everything changed in all kinds of different ways. The Mao portrait, the giant Mao portrait that you see looking out onto Tiananmen Square, before it was there was a Chiang Kai-shek portrait in the 1940s. So Mao took the personality cult to new levels that Chiang Kai-shek never did, but he didn't invent it completely from scratch. And Chiang Kai-shek was the head of a single-party state, essentially, which had some things in common. It was anti-communist, but it had some things in common with the Communist Party. Both Mao and Chiang Kai-shek revered the same earlier Chinese revolutionary leader, Sun Yat-sen, who you see in this picture next to Mao and that picture next to Chiang Kai-shek. And they each had ways of claiming that they were the true inheritor of his belief system. And right before he died, he said, both of these parties can help realize my vision by working together. After he died, they've been fighting ever since. Of course, we can't think of any other setting where groups that trace themselves back to the same heroic figure fight to the death. In European religion wars and things like that, you wouldn't see anything like that. Another thing, and I love to show some of these pictures, is one of the things about Chiang Kai-shek's China and China right now is Chiang Kai-shek's China and China right now came at the end of a period in which Chinese political modes moved to some extent to be more in step with certain global norms. This was the first American president going to China. Ulysses S. Grant went there as a former president, and he met with one of China's most powerful men, General Li Hongzhang, who made a joke that he thought it was interesting, and this was really a joke, reported by General Grant's people who accompanied General Grant. These two became good friends. They had both worked to suppress a giant rebellion in their country. Li Hongzhang had suppressed the Taiping uprising that was a rebellion of sorts, and Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War. They became friends. They had much in common. And Li Hongzhang said, it's very funny that Grant and I should get along so well when my name is General Li. Okay, so they were dressed totally different. They looked like they came from totally different worlds. And the Empress Dowager, when she met with famous women, this was the last powerful woman of the Qing dynasty, again, they seemed to come from different worlds. And one of the things that a wonderful book called The Birth of the Modern World by Chris Bailey, that's a kind of history of early stages of globalization, said one important thing about globalization from the late 1700s to the early 20th century was you went from a period where powerful men around the world dressed totally differently. In the South Sea Islands in ritual undress in Britain and elaborate regalia in other parts of the world. But by the early 20th century, powerful men, when they came together, were all dressed in these frock coats and top hats and were mutually intelligible. And that showed something about moves toward uniformity without homogenization. Here is Sun Yat-sen, the first leader of a Chinese republic. He becomes called a president as opposed to an emperor, and he's dressed with his wife in a way that looks like they could be in the West as well as in China. By the time you get to the Dumbarton Oaks conference, that's the Bretton Woods conference that's trying to decide about the monetary order after World War II, this is a picture where there's a Chinese delegation, an American delegation, a British delegation, and unless you look very carefully at the faces, you can't tell who is who. So the arc of imperial China to Republican China headed by Chiang Kai-shek is a move from being very out of step with these certain kinds of global political forms, even to the point of how you dress, to being very in step with them. Then when you get Mao, Mao departs from that, dresses in a way that nobody else does, is called, and the leaders do, is called the chairman. He's called Chairman Mao as opposed to being president. It's moving in very much different ways. When you get to Deng Xiaoping is still in that mode, but after Deng Xiaoping, you have Jiang Zemin, who succeeds Deng Xiaoping, and suddenly when he meets with Bill Clinton, you're back on the same page sartorially between East and West, and Jiang Zemin is now being called president, even though he's also general secretary of the Communist Party. And when you have Bush, this is a cheap shot. I always throw it in. When you go to APEC meetings, leaders from around the world all dress in their regular suits and ties and things, but at the last step of the meeting to say, we are all world leaders of a similar sort, but we're leaders of a particular part of the world, they dress in a particular mode of the host area, but it's just a funny picture. And now when you get up to Xi Jinping, the latest leader of China, not only is he president, not only is he dressed in a suit, but he travels now with his wife, who performs roles much more like a first lady. Powerful women always dress less identically in this period, but they tend to move toward, and they sometimes dress in ways that represent the place they come from more, which in this picture of the meeting with the president or the head and first lady of Tanzania, you see the Tanzanian leader's wife is dressed much more colorfully. But Xi Jinping and his wife now look as though they could, even though they're still running a party that's totally different than the American one, there's a move toward trying to gloss over that in some ways, just as there was with Chiang Kai-shek and his wife in an earlier time. So this is where the differences between Chiang Kai-shek's China and today's China are supposed to be absolute, but actually there are some parallels. And this is what that propaganda comic that somebody discovered buried away in their attic or something and put up on the web was meant to display. So then under Chiang Kai-shek and the American imperialists, there was oppression, but now there's this beautiful new China, glorious day. This is the story the Communist Party likes to tell. It likes to tell before there were corrupt officials, but now the officials all help the people. Now, corruption is rife in China. There's constant criticism of it on the internet. Any internet viewer in China who saw this would say, are you kidding? We're living in the before, not in the after. This is a picture of how police in the old society would beat you up and bully you, but in the new society, they just help you. One of the big stories over the summer was a watermelon vendor who was beaten to death with his own scale because he violated some small regulation by para-police in China. So what the Chinese netizens who view this say when it goes up on the web, and a lot of the most interesting critique is, life is like a TV drama. We're always time traveling. Another weighed in, this is like on the Chinese counterpart of Twitter. This is not time traveling, it's reincarnation. The scenes in the comics perfectly match that the current situation in mainland China is even worse than during the KMT nationalist reactionary regime. So that's one thing to keep in mind about China. For the stories about the past and the present being disconnected, there are parallels with the problems that are coming up in China now and that were present then, and people think in these kinds of historical terms. Point 2, Brave New World versus 1984. 1984 used to be always was considered the dystopian novel of the 20th century that told you how communism worked. That was the key that unlocked those versions of totalitarianism that were associated with the Soviet Union and China. Brave New World, on the other hand, by Aldous Huxley, in which rulers ruled not by what Orwell called, in 1984, Orwell said it was the boot on the face over and over again. People were kept in line by fear. The government told you 2 + 2 = 5, you had to say 2 + 2 = 5. So it was brainwashing, it was control through fear. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, the other great dystopian novel of the period, said the rulers of the future would rule not through that, but by manipulating pleasures and playing to your desires, by keeping people so busily distracted and entertained that they wouldn't want to rebel. So how many of you have read 1984? Brave New World? Okay. For a generation less familiar with these, with especially Brave New World, it's like the Matrix. If you're taking, before you take the pill and realize the falseness, you're living in Brave New World. Once you see the real way power is done, you're in 1984. Or to be even more current with my pop culture things, The Hunger Games is a mixture of 1984 and Brave New World. There's a lot of control through fear, but the spectacle that keeps people distracted of the actual Hunger Games is the Brave New World bread and circuses kind of thing. So China used to always be seen, since it was communist, as 1984 was the way to unlock how the people stayed in power. But I think increasingly in recent years, Brave New World is equally important as a key to it. There's still some cases of boot on the face in certain kinds of settings. The state can be remorseless. And it can tell you that 2 + 2 = 5, and you have to believe it, when they claim there was no massacre in 1989, when, of course, there was a massacre, not actually on Tiananmen Square, near there, but there's that. But a lot of what's going on in China now is much more the world of Brave New World, of desires and consumerism and keeping yourself happily distracted, which was always seen in the 20th century as the key to unlocking apathy in a capitalist country as opposed to a communist one. So I now think of China as having gone from a 1984 phase to more of a Brave New World one, but that there's also differences of period. There are moments when things slip back into 1984 mode in times of crisis, and also there's a geographic difference. If you look at different parts of the country, this was a sign of during the 1984 mode of during the Cultural Revolution, where everybody had to chant the same thing over and over again. You don't see those kinds of scenes anymore as much, where you have to present your loyalty. But if you see them, if you see cases where the state is remorseless, it's going to be in some parts of the country more than others, like Tibet and Xinjiang, where they'll force people to express conformity with beliefs or get in trouble. In much of the rest of the country, they allow people to believe whatever they want as long as they don't act on it. And in Hong Kong, which is part of the People's Republic of China, it's all Brave New World and not 1984. You can even have protests there, if you want to break out of that, and say, we don't need no thought control. This was in a protest against mandatory patriotic education in Hong Kong, in which there were protests against it of a sort that were unimaginable in a kind of 1984 world. In a true 1984 world, you can't read books that criticize totalitarianism. In China now, you can buy books like Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt in translation in China because, in fact, the government wants you to be able to buy these things because it's actually a consumer good that might keep intellectuals happily distracted by reading their work. You can even buy 1984, which was banned in every so-called 1984 state would have 1984 banned because it would be such a subversive work. In the Soviet Union, all intellectuals had read it, but they'd read it in underground editions. Now in China, it's not just sold 1984, there's a 1984 bookstore in Shanghai, the only one that I know of in the world. A third point, and I'll rush through these so there's time for questions. There's no single PRC internet story. The story about the internet that you'll hear most in the news is about censorship, and you'll hear about sometimes or about US versus China with the internet, Google versus China. The story isn't just about censorship, and it's also not just about the US. There are other things going on. The key thing to remember about the internet in China is what most people are doing most of the time on the internet is the same thing most people are doing most of the time other places on the internet. They're trying to decide where to go to eat that night, what movies are playing lately, who they might want to hook up with, where they can get a good deal on something, or playing first-person shooter games or other kinds of things, or watching downloaded movies, all the kinds of things, which again is a way thinking of Brave New World as well as 1984 really helps. In 1984, it would all be about censorship. And it's not all about America. It's also about East Asian influences. So this is the equivalent. You'll hear that Facebook was banned in China. But China has something a lot like Facebook, a couple of things. Social media like Facebook, just like Twitter's banned, but they have something like Twitter. And I wanted to ask somebody, so what exactly is different about the Chinese counterpart to Facebook? And I finally found some high school students from the US who spent a year in China, and one of them had done a report on Facebook versus QQ, one of these. And she said, well, one difference is that in China, you're more likely to put your salary on your personal information. And it goes back to a time when most Chinese had roughly the same salary, so it wasn't viewed that much of a private thing. So I got that. And I said, and the differences don't always have to be political. They don't always about censorship. They don't always have to be political. They said, well, another thing is that you put your blood type. And that I had no idea. And the only thing I could think of was a political story. China had an AIDS crisis, a tainted blood crisis, where the government covered up the fact there was tainted blood. And I thought maybe you wanted to know who in your friend group was the same blood type for a transfusion. This one shook her head, like, you're so far off. Does anybody here know why you would put your blood type on a social networking site? When I ask this in Irvine, a lot of people say, sure, because there are a lot of students from Taiwan, Korea, Japan, or China. You put your blood type up because it's like your sign of the zodiac. There's a belief system throughout much of East Asia, a popular thing, that who you might want to hook up with might depend on whether the compatibility of your blood types. And even what you might want to do, like there's a guide to enjoying Tokyo with if you're A positive. Things like this. In Japan, baseball cards list the player's blood type. We list height and weight. You do this. But so anyway, so it was so far off from being political, and it also reminds you that when we talk about China becoming more in touch with the rest of the world, it doesn't just mean us. There's a lot of admiration for American popular culture, but for every McDonald's that opened, there have been 5 karaoke bars. So there are influences by other parts of the world besides just the US. And it's not always just China and the US, and here's an example. The same story can mean things differently. I was in India for a week, my only trip there. And I hate it when people come back from their first trip to China and write something about it. But I wrote something about India. But I wrote about America and China and India. And I've lived in America a lot and China a little. So here's what happened. While I was in India, the story broke that a competitor to Google Earth had been made in China. And that they were and this was told in the American press as a story of China versus Google, this battle over kind of economics where China and Google had been at odds, and China was trying to stick it to America in a kind of economic terms. But in India, it was told very differently. Just as there are those islands that China and Japan both claim, there are parts of land that both India and China claim are historically theirs. And on the competitor to Google Earth, the Chinese mapping program showed those areas as part of China. So in the Indian press that I read when I was in India, this was told as a political story rather than an economic one. Now, Google, being very clever, soon started coming up with alternative versions of its maps so that if you were Chinese and logging on, you could see those parts of India listed as part of China. If you went from India, you would see them as part of India. All right. 4th point, we're almost at the end. The big China question circa 1979, remember that key year I mentioned, is totally different from what it is now. The big question then was, will China be able to modernize? Will China be able to go from being a weak, unstable China to a strong, stable China? And the curious part was that Americans were rooting for China to get stronger and more stable after the period of the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping called for 4 modernizations in agriculture, industry, science, and defense. That's well known and well remembered. What's not so well known and well remembered is that America was rooting for him to achieve those modernizations. And that dissidents who were criticizing Deng Xiaoping were not, as some now say, criticizing development run amok. They were saying China needs to modernize and develop fast, but it can't unless it democratizes first. So There was a famous American who, during Deng Xiaoping's visit to America, said, "Mr. Vice Premier, it's a great joy that we welcome you to our country, and we hope that your people and you will be able to achieve your new long march toward modernization in this century." And I have a free copy, unfortunately the first edition of the book. I ran out of my new edition. To anybody who can tell me who this famous American who said that was. Yes?
I cheated, so I know the answer.
All right, let's get the wrong answers that are fun first. Which famous American would have said this to Deng Xiaoping in 1979? Nixon's the good wrong answer I like to get. Reagan's another good wrong answer I like to get. And Carter, but tell us the right answer. John Denver. He was invited to play for Deng Xiaoping and Deng Xiaoping's wife. He played Rocky Mountain High, which I think would have mystified them what this was. But Country Roads, which then became a big hit in China and was one of the most commonly requested songs if you were an American in there in the 80s or even after. And he was one of the first Western singers to tour China. And when China was holding tight on letting in too much foreign culture, he was in there. But more interesting even than John Denver rooting, and others in America, including the president, rooting for China to modernize quickly, was what critics of Deng Xiaoping said: without democratization and modernization, and economic growth will confront insurmountable obstacles. This was Wei Jingsheng, the most important dissident of the time, a leader of the Democracy Wall movement, who then was forced into exile later. So here's how it was in 1979. Deng Xiaoping said, we want to modernize quickly and develop, and we don't want to talk about political reforms. We want to focus on economic reforms. The Americans said, yeah, go for those economic reforms, because you know what'll happen if you develop and modernize, democracy will automatically follow. Here's what the dissident says: we want this modernization development, but you're not going to get there unless you democratize first. So you flash forward to the present, and China has more skyscrapers than the United States. Shanghai has many more than New York. China has the fastest train on earth, this high-altitude train to Tibet that's a marvel. So what you have is that China was able to pull off at least the trappings of modernization without democratizing first and without automatically democratizing after. And this is one of the big conundrums that we have to deal with in trying to make sense of China, defying all these expectations. And now protests are often not about, as Wei Jingsheng was, here's what we want to do. You have the wrong recipe for development. To develop fast, you will not work unless you democratize. Now they're saying, we don't like the human cost of this rapid development. Many of the protests now, as symbolized by this image of a hyper-modern building that you can barely see because of the smog, the most common, increasingly common cause of protest now is anger at pollution and anger at development projects that are seen as development being forced down people's throats. Last point. The US and China are radically different in many ways, including how the press works, and that we have elections and China has what the Financial Times, Richard McGregor says, selections. But we also have a lot in common. How the world sees us, and also similarities between China now and the US about 100 years ago. And I think these are all worth keeping in mind in thinking about China. Going back to an earlier image that I showed, that I usually, even in the kind of patriotic myths, the stories we tell about how our country came into being, that image of the destroyed old summer palace when a bad old days when foreign powers had too much control over our land, has the same kind of resonance and fits into a story as the Boston Massacre would, another almost local nod, would in American textbooks. And we're founded on a story about freeing ourselves from a kind of colonialism or foreign domination. That's something we can build on as different as the stories are. Some people will say an utter difference of China is that Mao is on its money. And Mao was a horrific figure who did some terrible things that now people would really look back on and say really should not have been done. But what some Chinese will say is yes, but he was a person who was important in the early stages of our country's independence. He was a figure who was a leader of a party that some of us still admire for all its failings. And yes, he may have done some despicable things or said some despicable things at parts of his life, but still, when we look at the money, we think of a different Mao. And you could say, well, still, come on. He was associated with really vile things, and he's on the money, to which I say, do you have a $20 bill in your pocket? Because almost everything I've said, granted, not at the same scale, I'm not saying a kind of moral equivalency, but the kind of total disconnect. If you look at Andrew Jackson, who defended slavery, who was involved in what we would now characterize as genocidal efforts toward Native Americans that are very similar to what we would think of others, that we can think about some connections as well as contrast. Not about utter similarity, but connections as well as contrast. But the biggest connections, I think, are between China now, when it's undergone this rapid development that's both exciting and worrying the rest of the world, and seems to be doing things on a scale the world has never seen before, and is making the current status quo powers very nervous, is very similar to where the situation we were about 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when we were making the status quo powers of Britain and France very nervous. We had trains that were going faster than any trains had gone before, buildings that were going up higher than ever gone before. And when we finally got our chance to host the great world events of the time, which were World's Fairs rather than Olympics, we didn't just join the club, we did it with panache. We hosted the biggest World's Fair the world had ever seen. We tried to make spectacles that would make the world sit up and notice and think not just we've arrived, but we'd arrived with a dramatic way. Very much like the Olympics when they were hosted in Beijing in 2008 had the effect. And China then went on to host a World's Fair. This was the World Expo 2010 in Shanghai, and it was the biggest World's Fair in the history of the world at that point. It was the most visited event in the history of world events. 70 million people went there. So I think we can think about, and other similarities. When Charles Dickens came to America in the late 19th century, he said, it's great that my books are so popular here, but they're all plagiarized, pirated editions. I'm not making a cent off them. American industrial takeoff was seen as partly with reverse engineering that the British complained were stealing their intellectual property. And there was an idea, there was both the excitement and worry about this. And admittedly, there were complaints about the safety of American products. Patent medicines, if something said made in America, you worried about it being dangerous in the same way there are fears now. So when I think about, I went to the World's Fair. You go to World's Fairs to visit pavilions of countries you haven't been to, and I've traveled a lot, so I hung out in the Axis of Evil part of the World Expo, the places I didn't think I would go. So this is an image I like to end my talks with, and it's an image of the lead up to the expo, which there was great excitement for. I like the image because it shows how modern and there are things like Times Square, like places spread around Chinese cities. This is just one in Shanghai. But thinking about American worries about China, especially now, I find it a little bit disturbing. It looks like this giant baby coming at you out of the screen. And so I've told this, in this talk, I've made a lot of flip comments. I've showed you things from pop culture. I've talked about things like that. And so I also like to use this image to reestablish my credibility as a serious scholar from the world of the academy. And I like to tell you that this picture reminds me of a line from Homer Simpson, who said, "Children are our future unless we stop them now." And I think this is where the American feelings about China have gone. We've gone from, when are you going to grow up? When are you going to grow up? To, oh my God, we're not the only big kid on the block. Thanks for your attention.
Make sure you speak in the microphone if you have a question. The microphone's on both sides.
The other article that I have read recently about China speaks about a couple who have two daughters. The first daughter is educated. The second daughter is not educated. It is basically a non-citizen in China. The older daughter comes home, teaches the younger daughter to read, to so forth. But essentially, when I finished the article, it seemed like that second child is a non-citizen of China. I'm hoping that is changing. Is that simply true in certain parts of China, Can you make some kind of social commentary about current China?
Sure, sure. No, the first thing I ever wrote about China was about the one-child policy back when it was young. And there is a hopeful sign. Just recently, this last party Congress, they've moved toward stepping back, walking back a little bit from the one-child policy. It was never purely one-child-only policy. There were always some exceptions made. Ethnic minority groups, because originally there was pushback and said that this is like eugenics or ethnic cleansing or something. So ethnic minority groups, though discriminated against in a lot of ways, were allowed to have more than one child. There was some leeway for, at certain points, if both parents were only children, they could have a second child and things like that. In effect, in the countryside, they would often, because of worry about labor power, the discrimination against girls was partly based on cultural ideas about male-female differences, but it was partly a very pragmatic thing that daughters, the Communist Party rearranged all sorts of things about social life, but they never changed the pattern of daughters marrying into their husband's village. So, and this terrible perfect storm, when the one-child policy was introduced in the late 70s, it was just when Deng Xiaoping was saying peasants could start farming their own land more and keep the profits. So just at that moment, when you were told you could only have one child, you were also told your family's well-being would be based on your ability to farm, and your daughter would go into another village and bring children into that, and your son would stay. So there were horrible things that were not intended by the policy, but were exacerbated by it, including female infanticide and discriminating against daughters. And then at a certain point, the government would allow, at least in some areas, you to have a second child sometimes if the first was a daughter. But what they often did was said, you can have another. I mean, they said, it's not that we're preventing you from having another child, but we're setting up a bunch of disincentives for it, like we're not going to give free education to that second child and things like that. So that created that phenomenon where, particularly with second daughters, they would become this kind of permanent underclass thing. And it's very tragic. I mean, the Communist Party kept saying, well, having a daughter is as good as having a son. But it wasn't the policy was saying that daughters were bad, but it was the connection between that. So there have been a lot of criticism of the policy from the beginning. A lot of Westerners didn't like it because it was interfering with people's decisions about family size. But at a certain point, even people who said, even if you believe, I mean, even if you're willing to cut them slack and say this kind of social engineering wasn't bad, the country didn't need it. Demographically, they were going to have a problem. Maybe there was something early on to prevent a population explosion, but now they have a rapidly graying population. And so it's taken a while for them to walk back from it, partly because the Communist Party, like not uniquely, hates to admit it's made a mistake, and so it kind of kept going on. But another reason, which is really sick, but it reveals an important thing about the structure, is there was an economic incentive for local officials who made money off bribes to look the other way if a rich family wanted to have an extra child. So part of the way they were lining their pockets, and they would levy fees and fines and things like that. And so the people who were better off could have that extra child and could maybe pay, but were paying into local things. So there was all this resistance to it by the center not wanting to admit a mistake and some local officials not wanting to give up this revenue stream. So that's part of what I hope that answers some of it. There's somebody down here too. Okay.
Came out of the woods this weekend. Got in my car, driving down the highway, and I was going through the old channel search, and I was able to pick up a show with a Chinese business journalist with the Wall Street Journal talking to the host. And what she was describing was the Chinese model for the last 40 years has fully matured, that the cheap labor supplies are gone. Just as you said, the smokestack industries in these major cities are not popular. Peasants not wanting to relocate from city and urban life back to the peasant lifestyle, and that they were going to transform themselves into an economy, basically a brain economy, which is like our economy, where you invent things and such. What they talked about was the requirement for the government to release themselves from as much control that it was easy to transfer from an agricultural to a industrial economy, but to move from an industrial economy to a brain economy wasn't going to be as easy because it's such a fluid and dynamic environment. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, I mean, that's an astute analysis that fits with, I think, what a lot of people, the best journalists have been talking about. And I think this is where it's going to be a serious challenge for the Chinese government, because it once again, in the latest plenum, they're talking about how they want to do economic reforms, but not political reforms. And Xi Jinping has not been good about issues like censorship. He hasn't been liberalizing. So he once again wants to he's kind of doubling down, so far at least, on the Deng Xiaoping strategy, which was the sort of early Singapore strategy, which is keep one party tight control, but unleash these economic energies. Now, Singapore has moved toward more fluidity in other realms, in part to make this move toward a more creative and idea-driven economy to some extent. But China, is dealing with it at a very different size, and a real unwillingness to loosen the kinds of controls. So I think it's going to be an incredibly challenging period with the demographic challenge, with the fact that some people who were left behind by the economic reforms kept waiting for their chance to be living better. And so having high growth rates kept that dream alive. So if growth slows, those people get increasingly pissed off because they feel they're never going to get their chance. If growth continues at a rapid rate, issues such as environmental degradation keeps going at a terrible rate and leads to a different kind of discontent. And so, yeah, I mean, I think all of the challenges facing the Chinese Communist Party leadership going forward are enormous. And I think the worrisome part to me is that with all of these things being undermined, one of the only stories that they have that still really works is that kind of, without us, would China be as strong as it is in the world thing, which they keep doubling down on with things like trying to ramp up popular nationalism. And their other argument is, even if you don't like where things are going, what's the good alternative to imagine? And I think one reason they stay in power, as long as they do, is the fact that the rest of the world is in such sorry shape. I mean, I think really we like to think that 1989 in Eastern Europe made it more likely the Chinese Communist Party would fall. But it didn't. It wasn't as though the Chinese looked around the world and said, wow, all those countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc or Yugoslavia are all doing so wonderfully. They looked around and said, some are doing well, but some of them are really disaster cases. And so the Chinese Communist Party, knowing that China's had a lot of periods of instability and chaos, is saying, are you certain that after us, what will happen will be what you desire, not just a really horrific period? And I think you've got the same thing now after Arab Spring. Initially, people looked at Tahrir Square, were really inspired, and said, boy, surely people in China will realize that if they do something like that, things will get better. But then a few years later, you look at some places have really improved, but some places are exactly what the nightmare fear is of that way. So I think those are the combinations of things. Yeah, and then
Could you talk a little bit about what the China learned from the fall of the Soviet Union and how that's impacted the way they want to involve as leadership? In particular, maybe talk a little bit about the role of the emperor in China and how they see that fits into the way the Chinese people see leadership.
Wow, yeah, great questions. Well, first of all, we sometimes hope for, which Chinese leader will be a Gorbachev. The one thing the Chinese leaders know they don't want to be is a Gorbachev. So Gorbachev is thought of as, again, if you think in these terms, as the person who, under his watch, the Communist Party lost power, but also Russia shrank. I mean, Moscow went from being the capital of a powerful, massive country to a much less powerful, less massive country. And the idea is that that's the thing you really don't, that's the thing you want to avoid. There are a variety of interesting things with the imperial, the legacy of the emperors, that Xi Jinping and his main rival, or seemed to be potential rival, Bo Xilai, who then was disgraced and is in prison now, are both described as being members of the Princeling Party. Their fathers were both early revolutionary leaders of the generation with Mao. And so there is a way in which, there was this funny kind of parallel. Which of the princelings would become China's next leader? Under the Chinese imperial system, one of the things about the emperors that was different from a lot of Western ones, it wasn't necessarily one son who was clearly destined to be the next monarch, the oldest son in the West. So a lot of the tension or drama or scandals in imperial China could come by struggles between the princes. And so you had, with the Bo Xilai and Xi Jinping, you could see a kind of parallel to that. There's a lot of thinking about these historical analogies, and maybe this is a good country to study as a historian, because the things that I'm talking about, the term princeling isn't something that historians are projecting. Oh, look, the Chinese Communist Party the leaders are like the old emperors and their sons are like princes. That's what Chinese talk about, and what the kind of chatter is when you're trying to criticize the government through analogy. You talk about parallels. The most interesting thing that's happened recently in terms of the thing that everybody used to agree on in Chinese politics, the nationalists and the communists alike, and even critics of the nationalists and communists, was that the good moment in China's past was the revolution of 1911 that did away with the imperial system. Now, some people are starting to wonder, since the Qing dynasty in its final years was introducing reforms, could there have been a possibility that now people are saying that actually a lot of the bloodshed and internal dynamics in the last 100 years have been about people trying to prove that they're the true revolutionaries. What if we hadn't had a revolution, but we'd given more time for kind of reform within the system? Could that be possible? Which is also a way of talking about different modes of change within China now. Maybe focus less on a toppling of the party through something like a revolution, but think about some kind of extenuated reforms. And what some people, and I think I believe this too, that if we focus on projecting for the future of China and we just focus on when will they have elections, that's probably getting off course. If we thought about when will they have a predictable kind of rule of law, so that might be more things that would push China in a better direction. A more transparent kind of government, a more responsive government, a more open government, and one in which even a separate judiciary or things like that could all be the moves, as opposed to focusing on when will they institute they're not going to do political reforms like the Soviet Union, in part because they don't want to have what happened there. But what about shifting the conversation a bit to focus more on things like rule of law? For me, what Xi Jinping keeps saying, I'm determined to root out corruption. Hu Jintao said that before him, Deng Xiaoping said it before him. For me, the proof would come that things were on the right track when a clear political ally of Xi Jinping is put on trial for corruption. And we know some of them are corrupt. So, does that answer? All right, good.
You mentioned several disputes that China has with its neighbors, and how do you think that's going to be resolved, especially with Taiwan?
Oh, with Taiwan, yeah. And by the way, if I didn't make it clear enough, Taiwan was in the position in '79, a lot like Israel is now with Iran, saying selling out our interests by making a deal with our enemy. And in some ways, Taiwan, there's been a continual effort by the U.S. to show it still cares about Taiwan. Taiwan fits into this story. The Communist Party has never given up on the story that Taiwan will eventually be integrated back into China. And for a long time, the nationalists didn't give up on the story that China will once again be whole again. It's just that the big area was the renegade that would be incorporated in. Taiwan has evolved in fascinating political ways in which the Nationalist Party still clings to that idea, but there are other parties in China that don't think in Taiwan that don't think in those terms. No, I think the tensions, it's very complicated because there are some people in Taiwan who identify with a larger cultural China, so are certainly rooting for Japan not to have control of the islands. There are others in Taiwan who don't feel that way at all. I worry about all of the disputes with China and its neighbors because they're the kinds of disputes that could very easily trigger into these kinds of things where it looks like just kind of strutting and showing that it's your territory, but if somebody dies, that can escalate in a clash between a Coast Guard vessel and a fishing vessel, with all of these things. So it's getting very, very volatile, and it's hard to figure out how to diffuse that. And China has, I think, it's a weird mix, right now between cockiness and insecurity that both drive the Chinese Communist Party. There's insecurity about its ability to maintain control at home over the long run. And it's worry about the stories it tells about its justification for power dissipating. So that insecurity leads it to be particularly assertive about the strong China thing. And then its cockiness about its power in the world, its economic clout, and the fact that nobody really wants to not be friends with China in economic terms, gives it the strength to be more aggressive in pursuing these kinds of things without worrying so much about the international repercussions. So that's why we're entering a very, very volatile phase. And that's where I say I'm a historian, not a political scientist, so I won't tell you what happens next.
We got a question through the internet from Jackson Haskell. The question is, what is your opinion on China's rapid adoption of cryptocurrency, namely Bitcoin?
Whoa. You know, when I told Oxford I wanted to be part of this What Everyone Needs to Know series, and they said, yeah, well, we can't do China. We have to do something more specific. So what's generating the most concern in America about China? It's the Chinese economy. Would you do a book on the Chinese economy, What Everyone Needs to Know? I said, I want to do a short book, but that would be a microscopic one, economics is not my area. I think it's fascinating. I think and I don't know enough about Bitcoin to know how to weigh in on it, but I do think the question of currency and even the fact that it's possible to think about the yuan at some point being a kind of globally important currency just shows us in a real encapsulation how radically China's place in the world has changed in, at least for me, living memory. When I was in China, there were separate currencies for foreign exchange and for Chinese. There was a black market in this kind of what was called foreigners only FEC, foreign exchange certificates. And China was so unintegrated into global structures. And now, economically, it's so integrated that we can even be having that conversation, I think, is an interesting thing.
Okay, go ahead. There were two more questions.
Yeah, just to follow up on that comment on the economy, China holds well over $1 trillion worth of our treasury debt. How concerned should we be about that? Will they act responsibly? Will they use it politically?
I'm increasingly worried about some things about China. I'm increasingly worried about global environmental degradation. I'm increasingly worried about the islands. I'm not worried at all about the debt. And one reason is I mean, it's very similar to the stories we were worrying about Japan when it owned a lot of our, not just our debt, but, you know, our landmark buildings and things. Those stories are very similar now and then. People who understand the economy better than me, who I trust, don't worry, like James Fallows. But also, I think the reason is that the Chinese Communist Party leadership is incredibly risk-averse when it comes to the economy. And it really, it would be a game of chicken that would destabilize their economy as well as ours. So I think I worry about them pushing too hard, being too aggressive about something like disputed island. I don't worry about them taking a chance with economic. There's so much economic interdependency, so many goods that are made in China that, you know, it's so much back and forth that it's really, and I'll tell one more joke about my favorite, one of my favorite Chinese writers, the blogger Han Han, who brought this up about the other side of American intertwinement with China. He's in a way like he's amazing. He gets censored sometimes, but then he then often frames his critiques so subtly that the censors take a while to figure out that he's making fun of them. It's kind of like the Chinese equivalent to the Colbert Report or something like some of his things. He's also a race car driver and a novelist. He's the world's most widely read blogger, perhaps, or was at one point, and Americans still haven't heard of him because he's not clearly a dissident and he's not clearly a loyalist. Anyway, he had this one piece that I really like called the Three Gorges Dam is a Great Dam. Three Gorges Dam is not a great dam. It's an environmental disaster waiting to happen, things like that. But he wrote this tongue firmly in cheek on his blog. He said, the Three Gorges Dam is a great dam. I don't get why people criticize it. All the criticisms are crazy. For example, there are some people who say the Three Gorges Dam is going to destroy China's environment. Have they looked around? Our environment's already destroyed. Then there are other people who say the Three Gorges Dam is a strategic mistake, because if America gets mad at us, they can come and bomb the Three Gorges Dam, and it'll cause massive flooding. Well, that's stupid. Don't they know what's right downstream from the Three Gorges Dam? The factories that make the Apple products that Americans are addicted to. There's no way they'll blow it up because they're too addicted to the things. So I think it gets at an interesting point about the degree of entwinement makes some kinds of conflicts. It doesn't mean that there isn't going to be all kinds of tension, pushing and pulling back and forth, but the kind of, you know, dramatic action with the foreign debt just isn't something that worries me.
So I just wanted to remind you, you offered to tell us at the end in the Q&A session, why is Finnegan's Wake so popular in China?
Yeah, it's a great question. So stories came out. Finnegan's Wake, it sold out its first 10,000 copies, you know, and I don't think Finnegan's Wake has sold 10,000 copies in the last, 30 years in every language in the world. So thank you for asking, but it's a multifaceted answer. It's a beautifully produced book. Has this lovely cover with an owl and all kinds of espresso beans and all kinds of things. And it was a labor of love by the translator who worked on it for 10 years, and it's only like the first half of the book. And it's filled with footnotes and things like that. So I don't think it's necessarily a popularly read book. I think it's being bought in part as an object that represents a kind of engagement with the world, cosmopolitanism, links up to an exotic kind of wisdom. And so I think I've heard some people are reading it because it's such a challenging work. And so there's a strong self-help and self-improvement ethos in China these days, which is also something like America 100 years ago, and there's a love of these kinds of, the self-taught, self-trained concepts. So some people are doing it for that. But some people, I think, are just probably buying it to put on their coffee table to say, this is the kind of person I am. I'm interested in the world, and, it seems kind of hard to grasp, but maybe that's because it's so deep. And in the interest of de-exoticizing China, we end our piece in the TLS saying, that sounds kind of crazy unless you think about the fact that in the mid-1960s, a lot more copies of the Tao Te Ching were being bought and of the I Ching in particular, with these hexagrams that were this kind of totally impenetrable book. If you ever read it sometime, the I Ching, look at it. And it says things, we put a couple quotes in, but I can't, like, horseman advancing, trouble, think. It's just really things that you cannot understand without copious explanatory notes, just like with Finnegan's Wake. And, and you put it on your coffee table in Berkeley or Madison as a way of saying, look at what kind of person I am. See, I'm open to international foreign forms of exotic knowledge. And we can do that. So that would be how I did.
Last question.
Hi. Since we live in a country that chooses its leaders by election and they can't seem to get anything done, if they choose the right things to do in a leadership by selection, will they be around for a long time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would phrase it differently. I'll put it this way. I won't dispute the ultimate values of democracy. I believe in it, but the dysfunction of the American political system is a godsend for the Chinese Communist Party, because I think there are fewer and fewer people in China. There's certainly fewer people in China now than in the mid-1980s who are saying, boy, I look around the world and a country that things are working incredibly well seems to be America. Why can't we be more like America? So I think it's not, I think in a sense, you're right, that there is a kind of American failures undermine one of the main arguments for doing away with the Communist Party system. But luckily, there are other places you can point to. And I think, I think Taiwan is an example, certainly, in many ways a positive one, that some people in China are certainly aware of. Any argument that something about Chinese culture doesn't fit with democracy, Taiwan is in many ways culturally, equally Chinese and has these elections. At first, there was a certain amount of mocking of the rowdiness of Taiwanese electoral politics. But I think as the fact that countries like that are doing well with elections rather than selections can be a positive sign for this. The real challenge is that the Communist Party has come up with this way of keeping a check on any kinds of alternative forms of organizational structures. They allow a lot of people to mouth off for personal expression and freedom, but as soon as it gets to be anything organized, then there's a clamping down on it very, very carefully. So they've had this thing that's worked so far, post-Tiananmen kind of strategy of we'll give you more and more choices in most parts of your life in exchange for keeping few choices in the political realm. And their strategy of control is they'll allow certain kinds of protests to happen to let off steam, but not if they draw together people across class lines or across locale. And so far, there's been no way to gain traction for any kind of move for alternative visions of political structure. So it keeps the current system in the case where you say, well, what's the alternative? And in part, they're not allowing enough kind of possible partway alternatives to have people start looking around. But you're definitely right to say that what happens to the rest of the world matters enormously. And that's the reason, even more than the I'm not a political scientist one, why I'm hesitant about any kind of prediction, is because it really matters what's happening in other places, what changes the calculation within China. And I think it's true in other kinds of authoritarian states. I just made my first trip to Burma, to Myanmar, to see a place soon after a move away from dictatorship. And I think if you look at what happened in the rest of the world, and I tried this out on a couple of people there to say, is this part of what happened? Why did the military junta there at one point decide to relax more and to allow at least Aung San Suu Kyi to go out and to allow moves to restart some sort of process? One thing is what was going on in the rest of the world. If Myanmar was so alienated from all parts of the world except China, the fear was it would become nothing more than a kind of colony of China. So in fact, China's rise, in a bizarre way, may have helped indirectly move towards some kind of open up a space for change in Myanmar. So we have to keep in our minds how what's happening in one part of the world opens up a space for change in another. And so I think the more that we look at different systems around the world, the more I think we'll see that, and that's another sign of the kind of intertwinement of things. Thanks.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.